At long last, we finally were able to drag Dr. Gaven Kerr back on to the Philosophy for the People podcast. I don't know, Gavin, a couple months go by and it's just not the same. It's just not the same without a conversation with you here on Philosophy for the People. So it's great to have you back. We're going to see if we can find, a marriage between Thomism and Kantianism.
That's it,
I guess. Yeah, that's going to be the project today. This is kind of a viewer request episode. I've been having a lot of people actually have been saying, hey, do more on epistemology, especially Thomistic epistemology. And we had a subscriber. I want to make sure I get this right, so we give a proper shout out. Neo-Thomist Engineer really wanted us to have a conversation, Gavin, on, I guess, because here's the deal, right? A lot of Thomists think like Kant's sort of the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
Like it all sort of went wrong with Kant in certain ways, but there are other Thomists, and I think you're, among them, but also Lonergan, who is, very influenced me, who thinks that there can be a certain harmonization or friendliness between these different philosophical schools. So please, your initial thoughts.
Yeah. So I mean, it's a wide area, to kind of, kick off on. And, thanks for having me back again. It's good to be back. It's been, I think the last time we chatted was start of the summer, maybe, Yeah, good while back. So it's good to be back. And it's good to dust off this epistemology stuff. This is what my doctoral work was on, the Aquinas and Kant stuff. So I think the best way to kick this off is maybe to give an account of Thomas's epistemological thought, just how Thomas thinks about the mind-world relation, and then, sort of clarify any issues there, and then see what Kant says and why some people might think there is a sort of contradiction between Kant and Aquinas, that they're doubly opposed to each other, and then whether or not there can be any reconciliation. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Yeah, please lead the way. Let's dive right in.
So I think for Thomas, to understand his epistemology, we need to go back to a principle that he employs an awful lot of times, which he gets from Avicenna. And this is the idea that being is what the intellect first conceives. So being is what the intellect first conceives, and to which it reduces all of its concepts. And Thomas's point there, he uses this principle in the first question of the De Veritate, when he is deducing the transcendentals. His point there is that the intellect never has a conception of nothing. Okay, you don't have intellectual acts which are about nothing. Your intellect, it doesn't become operative about nothing. There's no empty intellectual operations. Intellectual operations are always about something, okay? Because an intellectual operation about nothing is no intellectual activity at all.
Sure.
So that's an important point to bear in mind, because in post-Cartesian philosophy, especially with Descartes, you can have empty thought. You can have thought which is empty of content. But for Thomas, and this is important, you can't have thought which is empty of content. A thought is always a thought about something. So being is what the intellect first conceives. There is something rather than nothing that our thought is about. And there's several things that we can point out there with that, but the primary one is that thought is intentional. It intends something. There's an intentionality to it. There's an aboutness. It's reaching out towards something. And insofar as it's reaching out towards something, it has something in sight. Something is made available to the intellect independent of it by means of conceptual episodes. So when we're thinking about things, we're using conceptual episodes in order to do that. And probably the first person in the history of philosophy to point out that we use conceptual episodes to think about things, the conceptual episodes inform our thought, was Plato. Plato was probably the first to do that. We see him in the Theaetetus and in the Meno argue that there's some a priori sort of sense to thinking, that thinking isn't all a posteriori. There has to be some a priori element to it. In other words, there has to be an intellectual or a conceptual component which informs our thought. So if we cast ourselves back to Plato's Meno, are you familiar with the Meno?
I am, yes. Yeah. I think me and Jim might have covered at least. We might have done a series on that one. We've been through a number of the dialogues, but yeah, I'm familiar.
Yeah. So, I mean, in the Meno, just in case the gentle listeners aren't familiar, in the Meno, Socrates takes a slave boy who's had no training in mathematics, no training in geometry, and he draws a square in the sand, and he asks the slave boy, you know, I want you to draw me a square twice the size of that. So immediately the slave boy doubles the base and doubles the side and has a big square, but then it's pointed out that that big square, double the base and double the side, is equal to 4 of the original square. So he's drawn one 4 times the size. And by a set of questions and answers, the slave boy comes to see that if he halves all of the squares in that one big square, he'll have a square which is half of the 4 times the size, which means it'll be double of the original size. But what he notices that when he halves all the squares inside that big square, he ends up forming a square on the hypotenuse of the triangle formed of the original square. So a square constructed on that hypotenuse is equal to the sum of the squares of the two formed on the 2 other sides. And that's Pythagoras' theorem. And the boy, he didn't have a knowledge of Pythagoras' theorem. He had no mathematics. But through back and forth engagement with Socrates and certain sets of insights, he was able to sort of understand the form of Pythagoras' theorem. And Plato has a number of kind of, morals that he wants to, sort of draw out of that. And one of them is his notion of anamnesis, that knowing is remembering the forms or bringing the forms to mind, or calling the forms to mind. In other words, there's an a priori element to knowledge which has to inform our perceptions. Simply perceiving the squares in the sand isn't enough. There has to be some sort of conceptual enveloping of those squares by which the truth about Pythagoras' theorem and what's going on with the squares is made available to the slave boy. Now, notoriously, Plato doesn't think that intelligibility, the intelligible nature of the squares and the triangles, is something embedded in the physical thing. He thinks it's a form separate from the physical thing, and the physical thing just shadows it and mirrors it. And so another moral that Plato draws is that the intellect itself must be this immaterial substance that exists like a form with the other forms, and knowing is literally remembering our pre-existence to them.
Right, yeah.
That's a moral that I don't want us to draw.
Right. Yeah, right. So but the funny thing is for people who sort of get the first introduction to Plato, they almost miss all that initial stuff that you said, which I think is the much more interesting stuff. And you just kind of get like, oh, Plato's epistemology is just one of like remembering what we forgot when we pre-existed our bodies, right?
Yeah.
And that is an interesting theory, certainly, but it's not the direction I think you want to go. But the stuff before that, there's some cool stuff going on there that we should pay attention to, right? Yeah.
So our perception, the perceptual object and our perceiving of it is kind of saturated by form. That's Plato's point. And so it requires a formed active mind in order to bring that to mind. And this is what conceptual contents do. This is what conceptual operations do. We have these conceptual operations by which the object is made available to us in a formal way. And we understand the form of it. And this is something that Aristotle spotted. But for Aristotle, as your listeners may know, he didn't think that the forms were separate in the way that they were for Plato. They were embedded in the thing. They were the form of the thing, structuring principles of the matter. So that when we engage perceptually with the thing, we are striving to have these conceptual episodes by which we understand it. But the only way to do that is to engage conceptually with the thing itself. So the thing itself has a conceptual nature to it, or a formed nature, which is made available to the intellect. And this is Aristotle's distinction between the agent and the passive intellect. When we engage with something that we haven't understood before, say we're reading a new book or we're coming to terms with something new, the agent intellect is trying to form itself in such a way that it can have the right conceptual episodes by means of which the thing is made available to us. And we've all experienced that, reading something that maybe we didn't understand too well, and then it sort of just clicks.
Yeah, Lonergan's insight, right?
Exactly. We have that sort of eureka moment, and that's the agent intellect becoming informed by the conceptual nature of the thing in front of us. And so when the agent intellect has that sort of active insight, the passive intellect is actuated by the form of the agent intellect. So the passive intellect, that's the part of us which knows the thing. The thing is now available to us as an object which is known. And Thomas has that. That's Thomas's outlook. That's the mechanisms of cognition for Thomas. But this is a feature of being. Being brings into operation our intellect, because we can't have a thought or an intellectual operation about nothing, we're having an intellectual operation about something. And so being brings into operation those conceptual capacities that we have for the worlds being available to us. So the world is saturated by form for Thomas, and it's made available to our intellects by means of these conceptual episodes, which the agent intellect performs and actualizes the passive intellect. And that's how knowing occurs for Thomas.
Okay, great. So just to give this a sort of immediate application to so much of contemporary epistemology, and which is just sort of defined by various episodes of skepticism and mind world gaps or chasms. How does and I think we've covered this before, but it's worth rehearsing again. How does the account that you just gave, this broadly Thomistic account, help to circumvent or address some of these issues?
Yeah. So skepticism presupposes that you can have a thought without a content of thought.
Right.
Okay. So that you can have an empty thought. And so whatever informs the content of thought doesn't determine our thinking. So you can have thoughts whose contents are empty. And if you have thoughts whose contents are empty, then anything can come to fill that void, whether that be an object in the world, some sort of hallucinogenic, or some sort of evil demon that puts the contents into that thought. The point is that thought remains even if it's empty of content. And then the question is, what or who is putting content into my mind?
Right. That creamy nougat filling. It doesn't have to be nougat. It could be whatever. Right.
Yeah, exactly. And this
I obviously still have Halloween on my mind. Right.
Well, this was Descartes. I mean, this is why skepticism was so appealing for Descartes, because he presupposed that thought or mind now is something which, whilst in itself intellectual, can be empty of content. And the whole operative question is, what is putting that content there? Is it an object in the world? Is it a hallucinogenic? Is it an evil demon putting that content there? And the way in which Descartes gets out of that, well, God exists and is good, the various proofs that he has, and God wouldn't create me with this mind to misrepresent things, and he certainly wouldn't allow an evil demon or anything like that to misrepresent things.
I would actually love to get your thoughts on that, because I don't think it's like just Descartes' sort of, punt to God to avoid skepticism, because like clearly God lets us be deceived, right? So, but I think but like to kind of maybe steelman, I think he says like, well, look, like there's something about God's goodness or rationality or whatever, right? That like at least allows us to set a boundary, however far out it is, against like large scale systematic structural deception or something like that. And I don't know how I would develop that argument, but I feel like it's got to be, if you're gonna try and defend Descartes, like it's got to be like way out in that neighborhood if you're going to develop it, because just the idea that like, oh, God won't let me be deceived is just clearly false. We're deceived on all different matters all the time. I don't know if you have any thoughts on it.
So Descartes in the fourth meditation gives an account of falsehood, of how falsehood is possible. And he points out that falsehood is possible whenever the intellect hasn't been fully convinced, hasn't formed a fully clear and distinct idea of something. And so the will overtakes the intellect and causes the intellect to affirm something that isn't understood clearly and distinctly. So when we make a willed assent to something, when the will basically overtakes and forces the intellect to assent to something, that's whenever falsehood can emerge. And Descartes' point is that, God creates us with an intellect and will, as long as we use them properly. In other words, as long as we don't allow the will to overtake our intellect and have us affirm ideas which are not clear and distinct, then everything's working fine. But we don't always do that. So we basically are abusing these in principle reliable capacities that we have.
So that's more of a that's certainly better. Do you know if anybody has, I'm sure they have, but I don't want to get distracted by the Cartesian account, because we're not gonna that isn't the road we're going down. We're trying to steer around that. Okay, so let's circle back then, and let's return to the Thomistic account. Is there anything else we want to say about that before we start to examine Kant?
So the important thing about the Thomistic account is that you can't have an empty thought. You can't have thought and then some sort of content that you add to it. Okay, if there is thinking, it's thought about something. Okay, so there's always a thought about something, not an empty thought, which means that thought is intentional. And this is going to be important for reconciling Thomas with Kant, because Kant holds the exact same thing. Okay, Kant is reacting to Descartes and the post-Cartesian tradition, which holds that you can have an empty thought, and the challenge in epistemology is to find out how thought gets its contents.
Yeah.
Both the rationalist and the empiricist traditions do epistemology in that way. How does, something from the world enter into our minds? How does it get from out there into here? That's not an issue for Thomas, because when we think, it's not that something from out there is entering into here. It's rather that thought is seeking to grasp some sort of object that's presented to it, so that an object is made available for thought. So it's a fundamentally different outlook, and Kant shares that outlook, and that's why he disagrees with the rationalist and empiricist traditions on this.
Okay, very cool. So I guess I don't know if this is the most common story, but it's a story that I heard a lot, is that, what I said before actually wasn't quite right. Most people say it, and the things went wrong with Descartes. But the problem was Kant, instead of, properly reversing course, just like went off in a even worse direction in some ways. That's the story that's often told. But what the story Gaven is telling is, no, that's not quite right. Actually, what Kant is up to is something that is quite friendly with this more traditional Thomistic account. So let's see if we can put some meat on those bones.
Yeah, okay. So Kant comes along, and Kant was a rationalist. He was a thoroughgoing rationalist in his early days. He reads David Hume, he reads the empiricists, and he realized, look, we've got an issue here. How is it that formal thought about an object is possible? Okay. How is it that we can think about contingent objects in terms of universal and necessary features that they have? Okay. And that's the same issue that Plato's bringing up with, his theory of forms. We don't just perceive things in the ground. Our perception is saturated with conceptual episodes. We're always perceiving within a conceptual form of inquiry. Perception itself is a conceptual activity because it's conceptually loaded, and that goes right back to Plato. You're getting that in Aristotle, you're getting that in Thomas. Well, Kant is trying to deal with this problem. Now, the rationalists and the empiricists held the perception is conceptually naked. Okay, there is no conceptual content to perception. What happens is that we have experiences. Take David Hume. We have impressions, and then we have ideas, which are faint copies of impressions. It's at the level of ideas that you get conceptual content. But those ideas are only faint copies of our impressions for Hume. Yeah. The impressions themselves aren't conceptual. They're not idealistic. It's only at the level of ideas. So we jump up to the next level. We've got a new content at the level of ideas, and that's done something to our perceptions. So what for the rationalists and the empiricists, perception adds a notionally distinct content to knowing, distinct from conceptual episodes. There is non-conceptual content in perception. Yes. So that's what that's their view. Now, the Kant. So the issue that Kant is trying to deal with. How can we get this formal knowledge? How does that conceptual content come in? Does it just magic itself up out of somewhere? Like, right, yeah. All these thinkers granted that we do come into contact with objects. Okay, objects bring our thought into operation, and the question is just where does this conceptual content come from? Because our rationalists and empiricists had denied the perception is a conceptual event, so the conceptual content comes in after perception. But if perception is what puts us in contact with objects, then the conceptual content is something other than the object that perception puts us in contact with. Yes, and that's where the whole skeptical question comes from.
And how does it get its shape, right? How is it constrained? All these issues, right? Yeah.
Now, if we go back in the history of philosophy, probably one of the earliest that sort of adopted this view that the conceptual content is something other than perceptual content is William of Ockham, because that conceptual content, those universal and necessary features that we use to think about things, are features that we construct in our minds. Right. They're not features of our experience or what is experienced, because experience and what is experienced is it's quite blank. Okay, we don't experience the universal features of things. We construct those in our mind. So it kind of goes back to Occam's nominalism.
He's the guy that started all the trouble. That's right. We're finally getting to the root of it. Eventually, we'll have to go all the way back to, of course, the fall itself. But right.
This is it. Now, that's Kant's issue. That's the critical problem. How is formal thought of an object possible? Where does that conceptual content come from? Now, when we get to the critique of pure reason, there is a tale of two Kants, because there is the Norman Kemp Smith Kant, Norman Kemp Smith famously did a translation of Kant's Critique, and it's the one that nearly everybody used in the English speaking, even in the German speaking world. They use this English translation apparently.
Oh, really?
And like Kemp Smith was a Hume scholar, he was an empiricist, and he portrayed Kant almost like a failed Berkeley. So Berkeley held that to be is to be perceived. We create, our reality. We construct our reality. And Kant is portrayed in the Kemp Smith Critique along those lines, only with these noumenal objects. There are real noumenal objects. We can't have knowledge of those. We construct phenomena, and that's what we have knowledge of. So it's kind of like Berkeleyism with noumenal objects. That's the kind of Kant that we've been presented with. So it's a thoroughly idealistic Kant.
Yes.
That mind constructs reality. Space and time inform our intuitions, and the categories of the understanding construct our understanding. They categorize the manifold of intuition that we were provided with. And for a long time, that was the Kant that was presented until, I would say, in the late 20th century, we started to see a different Kant come through. And I think the reason why we saw a different Kant come through is because there were Kant scholars who were also reading Hegel. They were reading Kant in German, but they were also reading Hegel. And one thing we need to remember for Hegel is that Geist, mind or spirit, saturates all of being. It is the force behind all of being, Geist or mind. So everything is minded in some sort of way, or everything is conceptual in some sort of way. And this is taken to be a rampant form of idealism. That everything that exists is just some kind of concept. But in reading Kant in this way, that everything is conceptual, all of reality is conceptual, there were certain readings of Kant then that held that maybe the conceptual content that we have in our mind actually comes to us through the objects themselves and our perceptions of the objects. In other words, that we perceive objects which themselves are already conceptual, so that our perceptions carry with them a conceptual content, which is available then for our thinking to think about in a conceptual way. That was a sort of a newer reading of Kant that we were sort of seeing in the late 20th century, and it was one definitely championed by the Pittsburgh school: Sellers, McDowell, Brandon, Carl Sachs, people like that. And now that's the sort of Kant that I'm going to use to reconcile with St. Thomas. I'm going to give that sort of interpretation of Kant, and I think I'm on pretty good exegetical grounds for giving that interpretation. So that's where the conversation's going.
Great. Well, I'm excited. Let's go right for it, because this sounds good to me, Gavin. Right.
So Kant is dealing with the critical problem: how is formal knowledge of an object possible? So how is the object available to us in terms of its form or its content? And remember, with the empiricists, with the rationalists, form enters in at the level of ideas. Ideas are separated off from perceptions. Perceptions don't have a form. So it seems that we cook up concepts in some sort of way, and Kant's trying to deal with that. Well, what he does, the way out of it, and this is in the Transcendental Aesthetic, he points this out, that an intuition is what puts us in contact with an object. That's an intuition is what puts us in contact with an object. And Kant famously says, intuitions without concepts are blind. Thoughts without intuitions are empty. Intuitions without concepts are blind. Thoughts without intuitions are empty. What does he mean by that? We'll take thought without an intuition is empty. If you have a thought without an intuition, you have an empty thought, which is no thought at all.
Yeah.
It's a thought about nothing. So it's no thought at all. So an intuition gives thought its content. But thought, thinking, is a conceptual episode. So intuition is what gives thought its content, and thinking is a conceptual episode. So the content for thought comes from intuition, and that content is conceptual. So that means that the content of intuition is conceptual. Intuition has a conceptual content to it, which it gives to thought, because thoughts without intuitions are empty. So the content of thought is the content of intuition. But what is it that intuition does? Where does intuition get its content? Intuition is the faculty in us which puts us in contact with an object. Kant is very clear on that. Intuition is the faculty in us which puts us in contact with an object. So if intuition is what gives thought its content, so that the content of thought and the content of intuition are identical, that content of intuition comes from objects.
Yes.
So the object that gives intuition and thus thought its content is also conceptually saturated or loaded. Okay, so the object has a form or a conceptual nature to it, which is made available to us to thought through intuition.
Yeah.
That's Kant's Copernican revolution, that the rationalists and the empiricists up to that point thought that mind has to conform to world. In other words, that our clear and distinct ideas have to correspond to what's going out there in the world. Instead, think that world has to conform to our minds. What he means by that, not that we form the world, but that the form of the world is in agreement with the form of our minds, i.e. its conceptual nature. Mentality has a conceptual nature to it. So in order for the world to be made available to mentality, it has to have a conceptual nature as well. They're conformable to each other.
Yes. So and would you call that, a conformity, but not a correspondence theory, to be more
100%?
Yeah,
100%
precise, right?
Yeah, we need to reject correspondence theories of truth. Correspondence theories of truth are representational. They're picturing theories of truth, and they're trying to say what's going on in here is what's going on out there. Right. But guess what? That means that thought isn't intentional. That means that you can have empty thought, and then the contents have to be a perfect picture of what's going on out there, fit reality like a glove.
Yes, right. And that you brought up the term representational. That is another one of these I think fundamental issues where you can kind of drive the skepticism right in there, right? So the picture you're giving us of Kant is not a representational or correspondence theory, correct?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah,
100%. Right. Now, we have then the a priori forms which structure sensibility, which structure intuition, space and time. And we have the categories of understanding, which structure the understanding. But if we're reading Kant now as holding that the content of intuition, which is the content of thought, is the content, which we derive from an object, it's not the fact that our minds are structuring what we experience. It's rather that our faculty of intuition has these a priori forms of space and time, so that the spatial temporal features of objects can be made available to us. If we did not have these a priori forms of space and time, we would not be able to detect the spatial temporal features of things. Think about we can only see a certain sort of amount of the light spectrum, right? Now imagine an animal who could see even more of the light spectrum than us. Yeah. Kant's making that sort of point that those a priori forms is like a capacity for seeing so much of the light spectrum. Okay, we have an a priori form that lets us see this much of the light spectrum. A different animal has a different amount of the light spectrum.
And this would be like a natural capacity, right? This isn't like innatism or something like that.
Exactly. Yeah, this is a natural capacity. Yeah. So our faculty of intuition is structured spatially and temporally, because when we perceive things, our perception is always of spatial temporal particulars. Okay, you don't perceive an angel, you don't perceive God. Yeah. Okay, you may think about them, but you don't perceive them. Our perception is always of spatial temporal particulars, and so our faculty of intuition is itself structured in such a way as to pick up on spatial temporal particulars. Then when we go to the categories, Kant has this, this list of categories, quantity, quality, relation, modality. Yeah. And each category has 3 different options in it. And these categories are doing the same thing. Once we perceive something which is spatial and temporal, there are categorical features that it has, formal features that it has. And if we didn't have these categories, we would not be able to recognize those formal features of the object. So take, for example, the category of causality. If we didn't have the category of causality, we would not be able to recognize the causal features of the objects themselves that we're intuiting. It is because we have that category that we are able to see the cause and effect is going on. Different animals other than us, they don't understand cause and effect because they don't have a category of cause and effect by means of which they can see cause and effect going on. So, and that's just one example. There's other categories as well. So what the categories are doing, they're recognitional capacities. They're allowing us to recognize the categorical features of the objects themselves. And so the objects are made available to us for knowing through intuition and through the categories. And once the various categories have all been switched on, I talk about it like the categories are like, burglar detection alarms, or intelligibility detection alarms that are sort of set off when we're in the presence of the appropriate object. And so for Kant, then, the various categorical features and the spatial temporal features of objects set off the forms of space and time and the categories that we have in our intellect, so that there is a perfect conformity between the two of them in a best case scenario whenever it is that we know something. That's the sort of general picture on Kant. But we're left with this phenomena-noumena distinction.
Yes, right.
Now, one of the ways that this was always taught to me, the phenomena and noumena distinction, is that we have two worlds. We have a phenomenal realm, and that's the things as related to us that we construct. This is the idealism, Kant. This is the things related to us that we construct, and we have the noumenal realm, and we can never get at that.
That's what I was taught, right? Yeah.
Now, that sees,
and it seems so silly, like in various ways self-defeating, and like my biggest issue with that is, aside from like, those issues, is just like, hold on, I'm told that this guy was really smart, right? Like, and like, you gotta be fair, like, it isn't like, when you're like, I guess, contemporary academic setting in undergrad classes, it isn't just like Thomas Aquinas and these, like, Kant was kind of like quickly dismissed too, right, by my professors, like, he was smart, he tried, but it's kind of silly, so let's go on to feminist interpretations of Nietzsche.
Right. Okay. Well, I mean, I think, he wasn't read and found wanting. He was found difficult and left unread.
That's
what I would say about Kant. The thing about this phenomena-noumena distinction, see that two worlds distinction, the idea that we have the phenomenal objects that we construct and create for ourselves, and then we have the noumenal objects out there. That's an ontological distinction. That's making an ontological distinction between these two objects, these sort of two realms. Kant's point is that the phenomena-noumena distinction is a transcendental distinction. And what he means by that is it's an epistemological distinction. Kant, throughout, calls himself an empirical realist and a transcendental idealist. Okay, he thinks empirical objects are real. Of course they're real. Okay, and we are in contact with them all the time. The distinction between the phenomena and the noumena that he's making is an epistemological one. When we know those empirical objects, they are now available to us. The change is in us. The change is not in the objects. The objects aren't changed. They still remain the same objects that they are. The change is in us. We are now differently related to the objects, because in the presence of this object, all these various categories are turned on now. They're available to us. In the same way that Thomas would hold, or Lonergan as well would hold, that in the presence of a puzzling scenario, once you have that insight, you have changed and now you see the object differently. But the object hasn't changed. You just have now understood the object and you see it differently. Kant is making the same point, and that's what a phenomenal object is. It is now available to you for thought. When you're in the presence of an object and you haven't understood it, it's still noumenal to you, because it's not available. It's not a thing for you. It's not something that you have had that insight into in the various categories turned on. It's unavailable to your thinking, so it's still noumenal. And once you have thought it through, it is now phenomenal. So the phenomena-noumena distinction is not distinguishing between two realms. One, the in itself, which is unknowable, and the other, the thing for us, which is knowable. There's only one realm. Kant is an empirical realist. He keeps saying that. There's only one realm. Some of it what we know is, phenomenal. It's available to us for our knowledge. Some of it we don't yet know, and that's what's noumenal.
Wow. I mean, what a different story that is.
Yeah. Precisely.
And like how easy to accept, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's a wonder that, well, I mean, people are reading Kant now in this much more, sort of nuanced light. He's very difficult to understand, and so and that sort of idealist, strong idealist Kant is really well embedded in there. But the likes of Paul Guyer, Peter Strawson, John McDowell, they've all shown that there's this much more profound Kant than what we've been given. I do want to swing back to the idealist thing, because Kant calls himself a transcendental idealist. And what does he mean by that? Why can't he be a transcendental realist? I know an academic who used to set an exam question, which was something along the lines of, if Kant was an idealist, why does he have a critique of idealism in the Critique of Pure Reason? There's a section titled "A Refutation of Idealism" in the Critique of Pure Reason. So if Kant is an idealist, why does he go to all the efforts to refute idealism? That's an interesting question. Maybe he wasn't an idealist. When he calls himself a transcendental idealist, the key point there is on transcendental. What does he mean by that? A transcendental investigation is one that looks for the conditions for the possibility of some given phenomena in question. So that's what a transcendental investigation is. And the transcendental argument seeks to argue that given some reality X, these are the conditions without which we wouldn't have X. I think a lot of Thomas's proofs for God's existence are transcendental arguments of that type. Given that we have essence existence composites, they would not be unless we had some finite, essentially ordered series, the primary cause of which is the cause of the existence of things.
Right, yeah.
I see that as a transcendental argument. Okay, so Kant is a transcendental idealist. What does that mean? It means that the conditions for the possibility of knowledge are conditions in us. They're intellectual conditions. Idealism pertains to the intellect, pertains to the realm of ideas. And now this stands to reason, because a transcendental realist will hold that the conditions for the possibility of knowledge are not conditions in our intellect, but wholly in real objects. And we just have to sit there and just take in objects. And that's what Plato held. It's just bringing to mind the forms. The mind exists at the same level of the forms, and the mind can just be saturated by the forms.
Yeah.
But Kant, in saying that he's a transcendental idealist, holds that there's a contribution from the intellect. The intellect has to do something. Yeah. Okay. The intellect has to get to work in understanding things. What does that sound like? There's an agency to Kant's intellect. Okay. That the intellect has to seek to come to terms with things. And so the conditions for the possibility of knowing are, yes, empirical objects. He's an empirical realist, transcendental idealist. We have empirical objects. They're essential. But the intellect has to go to work in understanding those objects. And that's where the transcendental idealism comes in. That there's certain conceptual features of the intellect that need to kind of become engaged in order that this empirical object is made available to us.
And that just sounds like moderate realism.
Well, I mean, this is why we started with Thomas and the agent and the possible intellect. Because for Thomas, as for Aristotle, the agent intellect has to get to work. You can't have an empty thought. You can't have thought empty of content, and content just enters. Thinking has to get to work in grasping the object before us. And that's what Kant is saying, the exact same thing, that the conditions for the possibility of knowledge are ideal. They're intellectual conditions. There's something about the intellect which has to be switched on or tuned into the object which is presented before us. Yeah. So I think Thomas and Kant are saying the same thing here.
Yeah. Wow. Well, that is like super helpful and extremely clarifying. Part of me wants to just like snip out the past 10-15 minutes and just like make a separate segment of like Kant's epistemology demystified. I might actually do that. So like for me already, like it's like these connections between Thomas and Kant are pretty clear. Did you want to make them more explicit along any other lines, or?
Yeah. So swinging back to being is what the intellect first conceives, right? Insofar as the intellect works with conceptual contents, conceptual episodes, if being is what the intellect first conceives and to which it reduces all conceptions, being itself is conceptual. There's homogeneity between being and the intellect and what the intellect is dealing in. So they're not two heterogeneous zones. It's not an in here and an out there.
Right. So it's conceptual all the way down, right?
Yeah. Kant's Copernican revolution. Okay, instead of thinking that mind has to correspond to world, why not think that world corresponds to mind? Not that we create the world we see. That's not what he means. Rather, that there's something about the world which is homogeneous with mind, and that's these conceptual episodes. Because you remember the critical problem: how is formal knowledge of an object possible? Where is conceptual content inserted in? Rationalist empiricists held it comes at the level of ideas, doesn't come with perception. Kant holds that it comes with intuition, because thought without intuition is empty. Content of thought is the content of intuition. And since the content of thought is conceptual, intuition is conceptual. What does intuition do? It puts us in contact with an object. So intuition gets its content from the object it intuits, which means the object is conceptual. So conceptual all the way down. So for Kant, just as for Thomas, being, or the objects that we intuit, which are beings, is what the intellect first conceives, because that's what switches on these operations. The operations aren't switched on without coming into contact with objects. Thomas calls this being, Kant just talks about objects, but they mean the same thing.
And this also helps to constrain our thought as well, right? Yeah, which is another one of those issues that philosophers had grappled with, right? What's the term McDowell uses? We don't want to spin off frictionlessly into the void, right?
Yeah. McDowell in Mind and World, he talks, I mean, he's engaging with the empiricists, and the empiricists have this notion of a given, and you just imagine the mind being turned on, just spinning, and it can spin any way it wants. So what the empiricists introduce is this sort of given, which is outside the mind, which is outside of concepts, and it just hits the spinning of the mind and causes traction or friction, and it sort of grounds the mind. But as McDowell points out, that the odd thing about that is that insofar as the given is non-conceptual, it can't justify a thought, because justifications are conceptual. So what you have in the empiricists, you have an appeal to an empirical given, which can't justify a thought about that empirical given. So the given is meaningless for McDowell. For Kant and Aquinas, precisely because what is presented to us in perception is conceptually structured or formed, as Thomas would say, our thought gains some traction simply through engaging with the world in which we find ourselves. Now, Kant is very much trying to avoid the craziness of the rationalist philosophers, particularly Leibnizians, with their monadology and all that crazy sort of stuff. But he also wants to respond to traditional empiricism and the empiricist denial of the universal necessary features that we can see in objects, such as causal features. Because if we go back to David Hume held there is a nice, neat correlation between the a priori and the universal and necessary, and the a posteriori and the contingent in particular. The a posteriori deals with what's contingent in particular. The a priori deals with what's universal and necessary, relations of ideas. And there's a nice, neat correlation there. So you can never do metaphysics fruitfully for Hume, because metaphysics just bears on a relation of ideas, and all you have are tautologies. You don't make new discoveries, because new discoveries pertain to facts, which are always contingent and particular. Kant wants to undercut that and hold we can have the synthetic a priori. We can have knowledge which is universal and necessary, but it's genuine knowledge insofar as it's synthetic. And the way in which we can do that is that if the objects themselves switch on the categories in our thought, which categories are themselves universal and necessary, so that if objects did not have something like causality occurring among them, the category of causality would not be switched on. Okay? We just wouldn't recognize it. But precisely because the category of causality is switched on, there's something about objects switching them on, and we can attribute then causality per se to objects. And that's something that we can do metaphysics then.
Yes.
Because the whole time Kant is trying to do metaphysics, he opens up the critique saying that we can't help thinking about things in a metaphysical fashion in terms of their being, yet given, the philosophy that's come before, how can we do this? How is this possible? Metaphysics seems to have been destroyed. Well, Kant is, justifying metaphysics with his transcendental idealism.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you this. That was excellent, Gavin. Thank you. So in terms of this kind of Thomistic-Kantian model, let's just call it that, right?
Yeah.
How do you think it's sort of situated? And by that, I mean, is this something that we propose, like just assuming skepticism is false, right? Which a lot of people do, right? They're just like, I think Haldane kind of takes this move himself. I forget what essay it was, but he's like, hey, look, the question isn't whether we have knowledge. It's given that we do know things, right? What's a model to make sense of this, right? And how can we kind of figure out the range of knowledge and all that sort of stuff, right? And again, I think a lot of people were just kind of happy to accept that the sort of more radical forms of skepticism are wrong, even if they can't show that they're wrong. Or do you think that this model can be independently motivated and itself provide a refutation of skepticism. Do you see what I'm getting at here?
So I think this is independently motivated. Skepticism is motivated by the presupposition that you can have empty thought.
Yeah.
So that you can have thought empty of content, and then we're skeptical. How do we know that what has given us this content is the real world and not some sort of evil demon? That's a major presupposition. And skeptics typically don't justify that presupposition. They don't even see it. Descartes in the Meditations doesn't give any sort of justification for that until at least the second meditation, where he holds that the I, the subject of the cogito, is a res cogitans. So I am just pure thought, empty of content. Now, the interesting thing is that insofar as that's a presupposition which motivates skepticism, and Descartes opens with skepticism, skepticism cannot be used to justify that presupposition, but he uses skepticism to justify it. So the presupposition which justifies skepticism is justified by the skepticism itself, which is a bit of a circular reasoning.
Running in a circle, right? Yeah.
I think what motivates this sort of Thomistic-Kantian position is what Kant says in the Transcendental Aesthetic, that intuitions without concepts are blind, thoughts without intuitions are empty.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you have, I want to make sure that we link this. I don't know if it's available to the public, but your paper on McDowell it was published in the Thomist. Is that something that everybody can get their hands on, or?
Yeah, that's in the Thomist. So that's McDowell and Aquinas philosophical convergences, where I go over a lot of this stuff in relation to McDowell, not so much in relation to Kant. I think at the time of writing that article, I was just coming out of my, let me call them, dogmatic Kantian slumbers, that I was convinced by not so much convinced, but I was reading Kant along, the lines that he's, this idealist opponent of realism and all the rest. And I mean, it was coming to terms with McDowell, writing that article and getting more and more in depth with McDowell and the other commentators, that I really started to see Kant differently. That's something that had to evolve over a period of time and go back. And it's never easy going back and rereading big, heavy tomes. You think, I've got through Kant, I've got through Sartre. I'll only dip in and out. I'll not reread the whole thing again, but made me go back and reread him, again, and, just to see him differently. So
yeah, well, God love you for that. That's not an easy task at all. All right, let me ask you this, Gavin, before we ask you what other cool new projects you're working on. In the realm of contemporary epistemology, you have all these different theories of knowledge out there right now, right? My gentle listeners will be familiar with a number of them. Boy, I guess my question is, how do you think that this broadly Thomistic or Kantian model can contribute to a lot of the kind of live issues, and not just skepticism, but there's other issues concerning justification and warrant and all this other stuff that goes on in contemporary epistemology? What do you think would be an area, ripe for future research or potential for, somebody, coming from, I guess a largely or broadly Thomistic perspective, how they could contribute, right?
Yeah. So a lot of contemporary epistemology, you see this in the analytic philosophical tradition, is overcome by the minutiae of details about, how do we ensure that our beliefs are not only true, but also justified, and is justified true belief the real account?
How do we deal with Gettier and all this stuff, right? Yeah.
Does knowledge have a foundation? All of that. And what I think this sort of Thomistic-Kantian position can contribute is something similar to what, the contributions that we're getting from the likes of Heidegger and Merleau-Ponty, Husserl, and people like that. And it's to the extent that before we enter into that minutiae of detail on the mechanisms of cognition, we need to consider how mind and world relate. Okay. What's the relationship between mind and world? Because determining that relationship is going to determine how we interpret.
It's like a real proper sort of metaphysical stage setting.
Yeah.
Right. I was just reading a volume of Philosophy of Mind where the author was going off of just like, part of the issue of Philosophy of Mind is like nobody does any serious metaphysics, right?
Yeah. 100%. So there has to be that stage setting. And if the gentle listeners are interested in, so just reading some good stuff on that, is Michael Dummett, The Origins of Analytical Philosophy. And in that, Michael Dummett sort of points out that these epistemological issues were treated differently by Husserl and Frege, and the Fregean sort of treatment influenced the analytic philosophical tradition. But Dummett, as memory serves, reading him in Origins of Analytical Philosophy, seems to be very sympathetic to the Husserlian approach to these things. Even though Frege is Dummett's hero, he's very sympathetic to the Husserlian approach. The Husserlian approach, which emphasizes kind of a more intentional stance to things. So I think Thomism, Kantianism can contribute in that respect. And think about this: the whole sort of critique of modern epistemology is over this issue of the given. Okay, is what is made available to us in perception a given without conceptual content, or is it thoroughly suffused with conceptuality? If it is suffused with conceptuality, and so objects are conceptual, okay, we can have this whole sort of conformity of mind and world. But that also translates into action theory, okay? If we're going to undertake an action, okay, is there a given for an action? And now this goes the other way around. Is there a mental given which informs action? Because a lot of people think that when we perform an action, something happens up here, and then there's some sort of process, and we don't know how that works, but that translates into some sort of activity. But if we reject this myth of the given, that you can't have heterogeneity or otherness between the content of perception and the content of thought, well, in the same way, you can't have an otherness between the content of thought and the results of that content, i.e. an action. There has to be homogeneity between the two of them. And this is where Elizabeth Anscombe comes in, because she pointed out that it's absurd to think of an intention as the cause of an action, something other than the action which is causing it. The intention is the form of the action itself. Right, yeah. And so that if you are asked, what are you doing? Why are you doing it? You can say, well, because of such and such, and that's your intention. So this has an influence on action theory as well, and it gives us a radically different action theory from the more causal model defended by the likes of Davidson and so on. And I mean, I've published a piece on that, modeling God's action in creating after a more Anscomian, I would say, post-Kantian approach to action theory, which means that God doesn't have available to him all these different, sort of choices, makes one and then acts, because obviously that, conflicts with divine simplicity and all the rest. So, I mean, I think there can be fruitful work here in action theory. And in fact, there is very fruitful work on this sort of neo-Kantian approach to action being undertaken within action theory. It seems that action theory is where, all this sort of, the good stuff has been occurring. And now a third sort of interesting sort of cross-pollination here is with the later Wittgenstein, the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations. Because the Wittgenstein of the philosophical investigations, you think of the classic private language argument.
Yeah.
The private language argument is there to show that the idea of language being private in this sort of box won't allow for any meaningful sort of discourse. Okay. Language has to be available and publicly available in its meanings in order for us to, have sort of discourse intersubjectively. Well, that's what that seems to be affirming is the publicity of the conceptual, that what is conceptual must be publicly available so that we can engage in meaningful intercourse at a conceptual level.
Yeah, wow, what a great answer, Gavin, and always so impressed with how articulate you are with these otherwise difficult anybody who can make Kant accessible is a genius with a capital J, to my mind. So really this has been extremely fun. Before we go, of course, I want to hear all the comments from people listening down below. But you're always working on cool stuff, Gavin. So give us a teaser. What are you writing? What are you researching? All that stuff.
Yeah. So I mean, I've been working on this resurrection book for a while, and I keep stopping and starting, but I got some serious momentum going recently. So for some reason, it kind of just fell into place, and the chapters are really starting to come out. So I'm a good bit into that. And I'm sending them on to yourself and a few other people, to have a read of them. So that's coming along. Working with all this stuff, I decided to revisit my doctoral thesis, and it's one of those things, you even get it at the doctoral level, you get it at the professional level, where when you return to something that you wrote years ago, you cringe. at it, you really do cringe.
Believe me, I know. To return to something I wrote 2 weeks ago, I cringe.
Yeah. So I've been doing that, and given that my thinking on Kant has evolved over time, I have to kind of change a few things. But I want to publish that doctoral thesis, and the way the doctoral thesis was sort of structured, I looked at the neo-Thomist reaction to Kant, and then I looked at how, drawing from Aquinas, we could give a neo-Thomist reaction to Kant. And so the way I'm thinking of maybe working the PhD up into a publication is having part 1, just a straight up history of the neo-Thomist reaction to Kant. We have the Louvain school with Mercier and Noel. We have the Gilsonian school. We have the Maritain school. We have the Transcendental school. Going through those and how they reacted to Kant in the 20th century. Yeah. And then that was sort of eclipsed. I mean, after the Second Vatican Council, the Nouvelle Theologie, that's sort of, engaging with Kant in that way, kind of that fell by the wayside.
Yeah.
But I mean, I think there's a good story to be told, because this sort of more realist reading of Kant emerged in the second half of the 20th century, precisely whenever Thomists kind of put down their tools and stopped dealing with epistemological issues and started dealing with, the Nouvelle Theologie and, post-Vatican II, sort of how does Thomism fit into the post-Vatican II world, where we have this ressourcement and, communio and concilium, becoming very sort of popular. So Thomists stopped doing that more epistemological work. But that's precisely when, the non-Thomists were discovering this realist Kant. So I think, there's maybe the second half of the book then will be presenting a Thomist realist Kant in the way that, others have been doing that. And that's how I'd like to sort of structure that book. So I'm working on 2 of those at the same time. I'm editing a volume at the minute on Thomism Revisited with a number of really good contributors. I've been invited to contribute on a volume on the Summa Contra Gentiles, where I'll be looking at divine simplicity and the divine attributes and the consistency of those. So I mean that's a well-worn path. So I'm not sure if there will be anything too groundbreaking in that, but I mean it's going to be the usual sort of stuff. Other than that, I've entered a judo competition for 2 weeks' time. So
nice, man. Good. How's your shoulder feeling, by the way?
Yeah. So do the listeners know what happened with me with my shoulder?
No, I just know that you told me that you had I forget what the injury was, but
yeah. So I was meant to be doing an MMA fight at the start of October, and trained all summer for it, and was really getting tight. And 2 weeks before, I think it was in judo, I got thrown, landed on my shoulder, and sort of damaged the rotator cuff, damaged the AC joint, really bad. Couldn't lift my arm above my head or whatever. Yeah. It's finally starting to heal now, and recently the physio has been doing dry needling on it, helping to release it. So doing this judo competition will be a bit of a redemption arc, because I wasn't able to do my MMA fight. So this will
good, man. We'll be rooting and praying for you. I hope that goes well. Excited to hear how it goes. So you're just, just a little bit busy, but staying an expert generalist as always. So
staying on top of things.
Yeah. Very good. Well, thanks again, Gavin. It's always a joy having you on the podcast. I'm sure we'll bug you to come on again whenever semester ends and whatnot. Maybe we'll do a live Q&A hangout with you. That's always a lot of fun.
Yeah. Always happy to do that.
Yeah. So gentle listeners, if you like what you see here, please hit the buttons, the like button, subscribe button, leave your thoughts below, and we'll see you guys next time.
See you again.